Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Uncorked with Funny Wine Girl. This is Funny Wine Girl, aka Janine Luby. Every week I like to say how I know my guests and how they came into my life, whether I knew them before or how it came about, just because I always like to encourage curiosity, learning, being open to learning something new, meeting new people, whether you're out at, a function where it's a networking event, a chamber, a local chamber, or if you're out at an art show or any kind of performance, just being open to getting to know people, even if you meet them and go, oh, okay, I have their business card, but I don't know if I'll ever need them or whatever. We need each other, and I like to promote the idea of connecting, and you never know how we can help one another. So today, how this came about, I'll share, is you've heard me have guests on here before to talk about women's self-defense. I have a friend in town in Scranton who does tsunami self-defense, and that led me to have on as a guest Shira Bernard, who has invented, and she was on Shark Tank. She was quite young, 15 or 16, when she came up with something to cover drinks to prevent drink spiking. And I wanted to do an update on that this year, and I found out that she came out with a documentary. And when I was Googling her documentary, I believe hers was Say It Louder or something, it had loud in it. I actually came upon Loud Enough, Surviving Justice. And I saw that and I'm like, okay, I really need to dive into this and learn more and share this with my listeners. So it led me to Hilary Klotz Steinman. And so we've been having a little bit of conversation online and through emails. And it led me to our conversation today, where we're going to talk about more or less the justice side of it, how law enforcement treats victims or survivors, and what's being done to change that, and why it needs to change, and what's being done. I'm going to start first with Hilary. Hilary, this was your project, Loud Enough, Surviving Justice. And then we're really going to focus today on justice because we already had our conversation with Madi and Mandy, her mom, and we talked about their story, and really that was featured in the documentary. But just for the listeners who may have missed that, briefly tell me about what was it with this story, why you felt the need to do it, and then we'll get into the justice side of it with my other guests, Julie Germann and Justin Boardman.
Well, I first learned about Madison's story through an article in the Washington Post, which we really actually have Justin Boardman to thank for. He had a relationship with the journalist and had been advocating for the family. And after a lot of work and a lot of outreach, got that story, which went around the country, was picked up by the wire services. And I was so moved, not only by Madison's story, but by her bravery, her willingness to come forward despite the possible criticisms or blame or judgment, and was really inspired by this sort of unique legal strategy to try to get justice when the criminal justice system is very challenging for survivors to navigate, and the outcomes are so poor. And so the creativity there sort of blew my mind. And on a personal level, at the time, I had a 19-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old daughter. And so it was certainly very easy for me to imagine her being a first-year college student and going through something similar. And of course that, really struck a nerve. And the other thing is, women of my generation, including myself, went through very similar things. And we didn't share it with friends. We certainly didn't share it with family. We certainly didn't go forward to the administration. And we lived with a lot of shame and blame and carried that with us for decades, including myself. So I was really inspired by Madison and felt that her story had so much, not only to teach us about what survivors go through, of what the criminal justice system, how it works, and how difficult it is for survivors to pursue justice, but also for older women or victims of sexual assault, for in terms of their healing and their process, to see sort of the comfort with which younger people are coming forward to say this isn't okay, to sort of help with that healing process for people of all ages. And, recently in the news, there's been so many cases of older women talking about things that happened decades ago. And so I think these stories are healing for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 54, and I'm grateful that nothing like that ever happened to me, because I was a little sister at a fraternity, and that was like a home away from home for me. But I made some poor choices, and I mean, I'm not judging, but I'm saying I put myself in positions. I'll put it that way, where maybe I had too much to drink, and maybe I wouldn't have been aware enough, and I didn't have training, and I wasn't educating myself. Whereas now, I feel like thankfully we're putting more out there for people to be prepared and to understand. It of course it's never their fault, but to be kind of prepared to protect yourself. And I was often not really even thinking in that way. And I will say that the way I was raised, I might have just been like it was me. You know what I mean? I feel like I would have been like, oh, I can't fight back. Or, especially if it was a person in power, where I feel like thankfully the one thing I think is changing is that younger women are definitely being inspired to speak out, to not put up with stuff that I mean, they absolutely shouldn't. But I feel like the older generations didn't have that. It really wasn't the norm, I don't think.
Exactly. There was a lot of shame and blame, which led
Yeah.
to a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulty in life. So I was very inspired by what Julie, Justin, Madison, Mandy, and also Madison's father, Jason, sort of did as a team.
Yeah. Yeah. So for those who didn't see, and it's a documentary that really it talks about a brave young woman, as Hillary had said, that basically the law, I would say the law failed her, the system failed her, and she stood up and was brave and fought back, and thankfully she also had the help of Julie German and Justin Boardman. And I'll start with you, Justin. I did just finish watching the documentary, and I saw that I believe it was Maddie's mother, who I believe connected with you first, and I think she heard you have a podcast. I apologize, I'm not familiar. I don't know the name. Maybe if it's related, you could tell us. But she had heard you on a podcast, and again, I feel like this is an important point too. A lot of times people are afraid, or they think, "Oh, this person won't respond to me, or it won't matter." We have to reach out, because I know I've done that personally, to reach out to people. You may not know them, but you never know, they could answer you back, and you answered her back, and that is kind of what started the relationship where you were able to help them. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, when it first got, how the connection came about, and what you were able to do to help them out?
Yes, excuse me. I'm happy to. And thank you for having me on. Uh, it wasn't my podcast. I was on a podcast for the Minnesota Star Tribune. I had
Okay.
done some work for them, reviewing sexual assault cases and so on and so forth. And Julie was also part of that project back in the day. And Mandy was listening to it, trying to figure out what was going on with her daughter, Madison. And she reached out to me on Facebook Messenger or something like that, and I answered her back. And she explained a few things that were happening. So we did a couple Zooms, and we came up with some strategies trying to get things done the correct way, the way that the system should work. And we kept on hitting all these different roadblocks in the system, namely with the prosecutor's office.
Mm.
The police department did okay. I've seen worse. Um, Now, with full disclosure, Jason, who's Madison's father, also worked for this police department at one point in his career. He worked for three different ones and had recently retired. And so he knew a little bit about the system, but he's also learned a lot since then. Like we both have during our careers, that we did a lot of things incorrectly. We did a few things wrong. We didn't we didn't know what we didn't know though.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of guilt there. And I eventually left police work, and I do training and consulting now. So um, we had quite this is a unique family. Usually you'll work with survivors until they say that they're done. And usually the system is so wearing that it usually comes pretty fast, where sadly enough, survivors will give up. Maybe not give up, they just realize that trying to find justice this route isn't working for them. But this family, every time we hit a roadblock, they would go back to the drawing board and see what else you could find, and kept grasping and grasping until we found this law from the 1880s. I had learned that there was something kind of similar, a system in Utah, And I threw that out there and it hit. It wasn't the greatest law in the world, but um, it worked and it created a lot of havoc, which was a lot of fun as well. And Julie can certainly talk more about how that was structured and give you a little bit of background history on that.
Yeah. So, Julie, tell me a little about, and again, I want to talk in a couple minutes. I want to get into like the broader sense of what's going on, but in the relation to the story of, Maddie's story, basically she was getting nowhere, right, with the prosecutor there, and unfortunately, as the documentary does a really good job of showing that it's the survivor really is being not believed or questioned, like they're the perpetrator. And I believe the term there was immature sex was what first came about, and they weren't even going to do anything or like try to prosecute or anything. And so basically, I guess as Justin mentioned, there's something from the 1880s where I guess she could call her own grand jury, since the prosecutor wasn't going to. But make sure I'm not like messing anything up. Please tell us a little bit more about that to make sure I've got this right.
No, you're absolutely correct. The prosecutor in the county where Madison's assault happened declined to charge her case. And as you mentioned, he called it immature sex. There were a couple things going on there, which, first of all, I think a lot of people misunderstand that most of the laws in the United States require not just withdrawal of consent or no consent for there to be a rape or a sexual assault charge, but that there also has to be force or fear involved. And that was certainly the law in Kansas. Madison was strangled. So there should be no question about force. But what the prosecutor got hung up on really was about whether or not, because initially she was consenting to this, right? This was a boy she liked. This seemed fine. But when it turned violent, she was no longer consenting. But the prosecutor had a really hard time with that withdrawal of consent. That sexual behavior can begin and anyone's entitled to withdraw consent and bring it to an end. And I think that's what the prosecutor was referring to as immature sex, that, she just, got into something and was too young to realize that it was more than she wanted. I don't even know, because it was such a bizarre denial of charges. So what this law allows is, if you get enough signatures of registered voters in your county, then you can call your own grand jury, sort of, right? Because that comes with lots of complications too. Typically, the prosecutor in a county is the one who presents the evidence to a grand jury. Now, obviously, the prosecutor in this county was not going to be super cooperative with us on these charges. And so, we did lots of things. We tried to get me appointed as a special prosecutor to present to that grand jury. That was not successful. The judge in that county promoted or got a prosecutor from another county to come and do it. So lots of challenges. Even once you get the grand jury, it was not without its challenges.
Mm-hmm. And as I was watching, I was wondering because I thought it might have been you that was prosecuting. I was curious. I didn't know, because yeah, obviously I think you would have, right? Yeah, I have a feeling you really would have done a good job, but I didn't know how that worked out. It was interesting. I have a question about when I watched it, that it was denied the first time because it was missing one signature, I think, of her mom who had gotten the signature. So did she have to get all new signatures to resubmit?
Justin should answer your question.
Okay,
about
because I thought to myself,
all the signature getting.
wow, I mean, I think I would have been like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah, so the statute described the form that this had to have, and we went over it and designed this form, and we had other people look at it, and we thought that we were squared away. We tried to get the court system to take a look at it and say, yes, the form looks good, and they refused and wouldn't do it. And so we thought that we had it good, and we went out and they interpreted it differently. That that Madison's mom, who was the petitioner, had to sign as the first signee on each page. But then there's only 10 signatures on each page. So are you counting her on each page? That just doesn't make sense, because that's kind of stacking it, right? Stacking the signatures. So, long story short, is that's what they expected. They weren't going to count them, but she had to sign the top as a signee on every page. Just didn't make any sense. And so they rejected it. That took us about 3 months to get the signatures. Um, I went to try to get back um, the original so that I could go back out and we could hit the addresses, because that was part of the signature line, and they had shredded it.
Oh, wow.
Well, luckily enough that there was a backup copy. Um, and so we started out again. Um, you know, Madison was certainly defeated at that point. And after a couple days, um, that again, this family and Madison, um, they just keep coming back up. I keep on saying it's like Terminator 2, where the liquid Terminator just gets blown to pieces, but then comes back up to keep fighting. That's this family. That's Madison. And she came back after being defeated after a day or two and said, let's go. All right. And out we went. And excuse me. And so we eventually succeeded.
Yeah. And I will say she's certainly an inspiration. I want to shift because for the folks, I mean, I'm going to encourage you to check out the documentary and the conversation, the podcast conversation we had with Madison, who will share the story. I really want her to share it, and her mom. So I want to talk on a broader sense about like the justice aspect and the things that both you, Julie, and Justin are doing. Justin, I wanted to though to a couple things that I wrote down after watching because they really stood out to me. I love what you said about and we've talked before, and I think we all know this, that, and we've seen enough. I've watched enough Law and Order SVU. I mean, I love Mariska Hargitay, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I mean, come on, enough episodes where it's like the survivor is often given a hard time. You know, it's how many drinks did you have? It's, you know, why were you walking in the dark? My friend yells at me for running. Unfortunately, I'm not running these days because perimenopause and life. But when I did run, I would run alone, and my friend would yell at me, and I would get pissed because I'm like, why can't I go out there when I want to go? But it's always the woman, and why are you doing this? I love what you said about the bank. You know, it's like like the bank robbery, like, oh, you have all this money around. What do you expect? I love that. I've never heard that analogy before. I mean, that struck home for me.
Yeah. And, you know, I think another great part of the documentary that Hilary put into it was having Julie explain some of the history of sexual assault laws. And I think that ties right into it. We focus on the survivor. And we don't go out to a bank robbery first off and go, what'd you expect was going to happen? You had all this money. And we turn our attention on the teller, for it was their fault that they were robbed. And we don't do that. We only do that when it comes to sexual assault and some domestic violence. And it's wrong. And, you know, we're trying slowly to try to change culture and things like that. But, you know, you were mentioning some other things about the self-defense and going out and jogging. That's not a women's issue. That's a men's issue. And it's a men basically mentoring men, or the strong women that raise them, um, to instill, you know, that it's on them. It's anyway. We can certainly spend a lot of time on that.
No, I like to. And then Julie, I want to talk to you about the quote unquote real rape and the bias and the myth and all of that. But while you brought that up, Justin, I was hoping you would address that issue because Again, my friend who would yell at me about that, I'd be like, listen, why do I have to do, and I mean, granted, I think you do need to be smart in the sense of, well, what can I do to, don't go out without my phone? Because I've made choices like that just weren't smart in general, like going out without a phone. That's not great because anything could happen. But to your point, this idea of like, well, why do we have to be playing, defense all the time? So talk to me. I mean, this is what I love watching you in the documentary because too many men, I don't think there's enough men, I should say, out there doing what you're doing. And I guess I would ask, do you feel you're moving the needle? Because I know you're out there talking to law enforcement, and there's this, I feel like now more than ever, and I won't get political, but there's a real, like, we're going back to that real men bullshit, the warriors and all that stuff. And it feels really not cool that being a woman now, because or I should say it's scary because it's that toxic bullshit. And I mean, when I read about incels and these young men who feel like they have a right to something from women, just talk to me about what you're seeing and how you're helping to change that, because I think that really needs to happen big time.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And it does seem like we're taking two steps back. We are absolutely, all of us in this field are trying to um, show and teach the correct ways. Um, you are getting the incels and things like that, which is absolutely the wrong way to go. And I think if you look at the real warriors ethos and things like that, you go back to samurai, things like that, is they were much more community oriented, and more regulated. Um, I think one of the things that is a core of teaching is mindfulness and resiliency, especially when it comes to men. It's especially men because they're creating most of the violence. Especially, I mean, cisgendered white male. Um, and the mindfulness and resiliency helps you regulate that temperature point. And it's also healthier for us. And it helps you see the big picture, not just what's in front of you. And I think that's a big step. I have seen some great movement. I also work these days part-time at a bar in Lindsborg, Kansas. I fell in love with the town too, and I moved there. And I've been working at their little bar and hearing some of the conversations. I was thinking, hey, this is going to be kind of cool because I get to be behind the counter and look at, some of this perpetration of alcohol facilitated sexual assault. But what I have seen is some conversations between men that I've never heard before that are more on the lines of them starting to get it. Not all the way, but better than I've seen in the past. So I think we are starting to move the needle a little bit, but there's so much work to be done. And excuse me, um, I also feel like work for me the last year or so has slowed down, but that's mainly because of where the funding for the training is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes full circle back to some of the things we kind of hinted on a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me, and then I'm going to go to you in a minute here, Julie, but I just want to ask, because I feel like I should have before, what was it for you, Justin? I know in the documentary, so you were in law enforcement and you realized, hey, we've been doing this wrong. And I feel like you were being trained basically by people who were doing it wrong, and how you're talking to survivors and how you're treating, the person and their facts, and judging them or questioning them. What was it for you that you said you're like, I can't do this anymore? What was it that made you have that turning point?
I think first off, the way that we're raised and brought up and trained in whatever jobs that we're in, we're trained also with the biases of the people that are training us. Bias is a human condition. We all have it. I have bias against raw onions on burgers. And so we have that. What what happened was me being in a training where the trainer was starting to talk about the neurobiology and the way that your brain reacts when the crap hits the fan. And what she was describing to me through science, that the reason I was closing and saying, to all these cases, because it didn't make sense. They couldn't get their story straight, blah, 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 blah. Or they froze and they didn't fight back. What you expect was going to, that sort of thing. And then I'm like, wait a second. If that's scientific, that this happens, I'm closing and telling all these survivors to go away based on evidence. That's not my job. My job is to take the evidence and prove the case, not take the evidence and say, get lost. So it flipped everything that I had learned and all the biases upon its end. And the guilt from that is huge. It still is. I created a lot of harm. And, I'm always going to be trying to somehow in my head fix that harm that I caused. But um, that's basically it. So it was the neurobiology of trauma, and then learning about that, and that goes deeper. So as you learn that, that goes back into the mindfulness and resiliency and the way that your brain is wired and all sorts of science stuff, which in most cases around the country is not being taught to law enforcement. It is, but only to them. So meaning we teach the military about PTSD. We teach police officers about PTSD. It's that PTSD and how it wires our brain that they also need to know this is happening to our victims the same way.
Yeah.
Trauma is trauma is trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for that, Justin. And thank you. I think it takes a certain kind of courage to do what you're doing, though, because I feel like, I don't know why men are afraid to push back on this, masculinity kind of nonsense, but too many of them are afraid and they're not doing what you're doing. So I appreciate that. I want to go to Julie, and I find it interesting, the timing of this conversation today, because I don't know if you guys had seen I saw an article the BBC put out today about the Metropolitan Police, this undercover report about, I want to get this right. It was like, here, let me say, it was a hidden culture of misogyny and racism. I'm like, hidden. I don't know how any of this is still shocking. But anyway, it was just interesting timing, because I just read that before I got on this today about how they were dismissing rape victims, and how they were, and it was an undercover kind of report in the United Kingdom. So not a lot different from here, unfortunately. But talk to me, Julie, about the what I thought was interesting in the documentary, this whole idea of what's real rape, and this bias that people have. And I think that's been going on for a really long time, and it's unfortunate that it still exists.
Sure, thanks. We have this idea in our country as kind of as a whole that real rape looks something like the woman out jogging at night, the stranger in the dark in the bushes waiting to jump out, right, and drag her to the ground, rape her there. That's very violent, that she's going to have lots of injuries to show for it, that she is going to immediately go to the police and report it, that she's going to be cooperative throughout the investigation, that she's going to really want the prosecution, right? And that she's going to show her trauma in the right way, that she testifies consistently. She can tell a beautiful story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And, she cries just one tear for the jury. And it's all wrapped up in 60 minutes, just like people see in CIS, right? That's our society's perception of rape. Unfortunately, it's completely wrong. 90% of sexual assaults in this country are committed by someone the victim knows, either their significant other, someone they're dating, someone that's at least an acquaintance. So stranger rapes are the minority. I saw very few true stranger rapes as a prosecutor. But so much of what our society expects is that stranger rape. And so when the cases that a jury might hear or a person hears about deviate from that perfect stranger rape, they they start to think that then the victim's lying about it, that it couldn't possibly be rape because it doesn't look like our picture of stranger rape.
Hmm. It's amazing to me that that still exists. And I know when I had Shira Bernard on talking about the drink spiking, it's the same situation where it's happening more from people they know, their friends or someone. I mean, granted, sometimes it's a bartender or a stranger, but a lot of the times, most times, it's people they know. Um, Tell me a little bit, if you could share, Julie, about your professional experience as a prosecutor and what you saw or what you learned.
So like Justin, I think I definitely had an aha moment when I first learned about the neurobiology of trauma. And, I hope that I did a better job after that of understanding victims and how they responded to trauma. But what I saw, unfortunately, and part of the reason I'm out doing the work I am now is a justice system that just really was not helpful to victims, right? So a justice system that would re-traumatize them, maybe in the way that they were being questioned by police or the way they were being treated by prosecutors. And I even saw in my own office that the amount of justice you got depended on the prosecutor who got assigned to your case, right? Were they willing to work hard? Did they want to go to trial? And it just so frustrated me that, this person didn't get the same level of justice because their prosecutor didn't want to be in trial that week and they sold the case out at the last minute for nothing, right? And so just how broken the system was and how it just did not help victims was super frustrating to me.
Yeah. And I want to hear a little bit about the work that you are doing. And then before we wrap up too, I want Justin to be able to offer that opportunity in case anyone listening could, bring you into different law enforcement or different departments. I know yours, is it Finding the Right, Julie?
Yes, Finding the Right is the name of my consulting business. And so in that capacity, I do a lot of speaking and training, mostly for police officers, prosecutors, advocates. I also work with coordinated community response teams that are trying to build a better response in their community, either to domestic violence or sexual assault. So I'll help those teams with developing a better protocol for investigation and addressing those kinds of cases. I also have a salaried day job position that I do. I work for the Texas Center for Forensic Excellence. So as a center in Houston, San Antonio, and North Texas, we offer forensic nursing services for victims of violence, but we also offer adult forensic interviewing, and I am the director of that program. So for a long time, we recognized that children should have a special kind of interview when they are victimized, and children's advocacy centers were created across the country where they could go in, be interviewed on camera by a specially trained interviewer. But somehow we never went, oh, adults could be traumatized too, and maybe we should give them a special interview that recognizes that they've been traumatized, give them the best chance to give their information. So in Harris County, Houston, Texas, we now do that for all victims of sexual assault. They come into our center, which is soft interview rooms. They have the opportunity to talk to an interviewer who is not law enforcement. It's videotaped, so law enforcement is watching, the prosecutor can watch it later. And I really do think it's providing a level of justice that's never been there before, and also just helping victims feel heard for the first time.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds so necessary. Yeah. You mentioned about, the different programs for law enforcement. I work, do media relations for National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI here, and they have, for the local law enforcement here, they have a CERT, crisis intervention team, but they're focusing on de-escalation from like mental illness or anything like that. So is there something specific similar to that is out there specifically around cases of sexual assault?
Yeah, so those teams would be called a SART. It's, not about de-escalation, obviously. It's a sexual assault response team. So lots of communities have developed them. Kind of the core members of that team would be your sexual assault nurse examiners, prosecutors, law enforcement, advocates, maybe mental health providers who work with victims as well. And so those teams the idea behind them is that they would be looking at their community's response to sexual violence, trying to improve it, troubleshooting when something happens on a case, having a team you could go back to say, hey, law enforcement did this and it falls outside of best practices. How do we fix that? So that's the ideal for a SART team, and lots of communities have them.
Okay. Oh, that's good because I had not heard of those. So that's encouraging. I mean, we need all of that. I mean, de-escalation, but also appropriate responses. Absolutely. Are you seeing what's your response that you're seeing when you are going out and you're finding the right and you're talking about this, the whole idea of like science behind this? Is it being well received? And when you do get resistance, how is that overcome?
So I think for the most part, it's being well received. I think the question you didn't ask me, but I'm going to answer anyway, is
Good.
that if you really want to fix this, it shouldn't be people like me teaching it to officers who've already been out in the field doing things wrong for 1 to 20 years. If we're really going to fix this, we have to get upstream of the problem, and we need to mandate that this is taught at police academies, that this is taught in law schools. People should understand the neurobiology of trauma. Heck, we should teach it to high school kids, right? We would all be better human beings if we knew this information sooner. And so I think, you know, how well it's received, I will tell you across the country, one thing that I am seeing is a big turnover in law enforcement. We had a lot of officers retire and leave. Everywhere I go, I just did a training for a large number of officers in Rexburg, Idaho. And I think most of them in the room had been on the force 5 or less years. And so the problem with bringing in a specialized trainer and it not being part of the curriculum is every time you lose officers, the new ones who come on haven't had that training again. But in that class, which was mostly men, I started the day with the neurobiology of trauma and explaining how victim behavior may look like they're not a victim, right? How they may engage in these behaviors that you don't think are victim behavior because of the way their brain is operating. And I literally could see an officer in front of me who was not buying anything that I was selling that day, right? And I even said it to my co-trainer. I was like, second guy, second row in, he's not buying anything I'm selling. But it was a full 8-hour day-long training. And even though his body language at the start of the day was not good and he wasn't engaged, by the end of the day, he engaged with me. He came up and shook my hand at the end and said, you know, I want to thank you for being here. I realize how important this is. I'm a supervisor. And then next time there's a training, all of my people will be at it.
Wow.
And so we do make a difference, but that's really the slow and painful way to make change, right?
Yeah. I love what you said about it needs to happen upstream. I am just going to reference mental illness again or mental health because of my work with NAMI, I'm kind of more aware of that. And it's the same kind of things that they're talking about. Instead of doing it like later in life, you know, in the workplace, which it is needed, we need to get into not just the high schools, but into, you know, the middle schools and, you know, talk about their feelings and how are they dealing with them. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like a big part of this, especially when it comes to, we can go back to like what, you know, Justin was talking about with the men, what do they do with their feelings? You know, the culture has not really, you know, my gosh, in my generation, it was stop crying, you know, act like a man or all that stuff. How to process your emotions and your feelings and what's a healthy outlet, you know, and what's a healthy expectation. And I think some of that kind of does cross over or dovetail, I think, to a certain degree. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. The younger we can teach it, more impact and the more change we can make in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Hilary, I know I've had you kind of on silent as we kind of expected, but based on the conversation I've had so far, I want to give you an opportunity to interject on anything that you wanted to highlight. Like I said, I wanted to discuss today more or less the issue of, you know, justice and everything, but it is so important that really this conversation is coming about because of what you featured in the documentary.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was a really special journey to be on with Madison, Mandy, her father, Jason, as well as Julie and Justin. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from the film, which is something that Justin and Julie taught us over and over again, was that, sexual assault is not a sexual crime. It's a crime of power and control. And for Madison to be a victim of this crime and to feel so powerless and to feel re-victimized by the criminal justice system, and to have that be almost as painful for her as the actual assault, that this process that she went through with Julie and Justin, not only learning about the neurobiology of trauma and learning how to stop blame herself, but also how to find her own sense of power and control. And so her journey, as many struggles as she goes through, and as many times as, the news is not good and they get knocked down by the criminal justice system, it's all steps in terms of taking back that power and control and to finding her voice. And through this film, in the course of the film, she finds her voice and she finds her sense of power and control. And I think that, what Julie and Justin and others are doing to change the way the criminal justice system responds to victims of sexual assault is really important. But in terms of survivors finding a way to regain power and control, that's also equally important.
Yeah. And thank you for that. That is so true. That is absolutely true. I don't mean to bounce around, so I apologize, but I do want to go back to something, Julie, like with as far as the real rape thing that you talked about. Would you say, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but we watch shows like Law and Order, and I joked about that because I watched the show. It's, I love Mariska Hargitay, and I do believe she actually does do things in real life to try and support women and advocate for them. But do you think we have a problem when it comes to like the media and the depiction that unfortunately kind of is making that myth over and over? Like is that impacting people's bias and understanding?
I mean, I absolutely think so. I got to the point where I had to talk about true crime podcasts and television shows every time I was picking a jury, because there is an element where people will go, yeah, that's just television, but there is a part of them that believes that's how it goes, right? And I would joke about it with my jury selection just to lighten the mood. But I was just like, we don't just wave black lights and solve crimes. That's not how it happens. And in fact, more cases are tried where we have no DNA evidence than where we have DNA evidence. But yet the jury has come to expect, DNA evidence in every case, whether it's a sexual assault or a burglary, right? They're wanting to know, well, did you fingerprint all the windows? Did you do DNA swabs on all the door handles? And that's just such an overriding unrealistic expectation that you have to address it. The other thing I think all of this media has done is made everybody like an armchair investigator, an armchair prosecutor. They are certain that they know best how to do our jobs because they've listened to so much on television and radio. And,
Yeah, that it's interesting because I agree. I tease one of my dear friends who does not listen to my podcast, but she'll listen to true crime. I'm like, so I'll say, okay, do I have to murder someone for you to so I can become featured on a podcast? But it is, and I say this, and I'm a big fan of saying we're all hypocrites because I think we all are to some degree. Like I talk about, like I think we're almost like, and I know this isn't sexual assault, but like murderers, we're almost like making them into like heroes or rock stars because there's so much out there. But at the same time, I'm not going to lie, I am watching, something about Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm watching on Netflix. So it's hard, but we have to know where that line is and to understand what's reality. And to your point, you're right. Everyone kind of thinks that, maybe they can figure it out because there's so much sleuthing, I guess you could say, going on out there.
Yeah, and it's true that we would actually have to give a stronger warning to jurors, because one of the things they're instructed is do not do your own investigation. You can only decide this case based on what you hear in this courtroom. And they have to be really serious about that now, because you can just go out and Google that named defendant after you finish hearing the case for the day, or I've heard of jurors going to visit crime sites when they've been told not to do investigation. And so the amateur sleuths are a bit of a problem.
Yeah. Wow. That's wild. Justin, I want to ask you about before we start to wrap up. Julie, I'm going to put the stuff in the show notes about so someone could have you come out and talk. Justin, what is you were doing training? I want to, where can people learn more about that? And tell me a little bit more about that actual training that you offer.
Yeah, so thank you for that opportunity. JustinBoardman.com is my website, and it has some of the classes that I teach. But I also do consulting. So sometimes I will meet with survivors and talk over their cases to see what if we can figure some things out. Um, and so I'll do all that sort of stuff. I'll do some press things, as Julie does as well, and try to help them figure out the justice system. Most of what I teach is the neurobiology of trauma. But then that goes into everything else that I teach. And so I'll teach for advocacy, law enforcement, prosecution, even community groups, um, just to get this information out. It's so important. So I do that. I bartend a little bit. I also sell rocks and minerals on the side. And sometimes I'll even go stain a fence or do odd jobs around the small town, which has been kind of fun too.
Yeah, I wonder when I saw the documentary, I know you talked about the importance of having like an outlet or a hobby.
Yeah,
And I had to look at it and go, what is he holding there? I guess it was a rock or something that had
yeah,
been
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was like, well, what is his hobby? I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
um,
so I'll
Go
make
ahead.
rocks for silversmiths, or I'll silversmith sometimes. And then I also go out and mine and dig and stuff like that too for the side.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, I do want to ask, I'll ask you first, Justin. So you actually moved to Kansas,
I did.
where Maddie and Mandy, her whole family is.
Oh,
That's pretty interesting because is it you spent so much time there that you just kind of fell in love with the town or
yeah, and the family. My life just came to a spot where I was ready to move somewhere or to do something a little bit differently, drastic. And I knew them, and the small town has got about 6,000 people in it. And so it was peaceful. It has one four-way stop, one bar, two coffee shops, and a bunch of art stuff, and a lot of fun, eccentric people. I like to think that I'm one. And then I could also afford a house where I wouldn't be able to in Salt Lake City in the position that I'm in and the way that I make money, which is consulting, is very hard to get a home loan. And so all of that above, and I went, I'll do a 5-year plan. I've been there about 2 years now. And I love it. It's been kind of fun. I'm actually even Mandy and I both um, have pushed each other, and we're both on the ballot this year for city council. And so it's just kind of fun to get involved in just small town America. It's a kick.
yeah, that's awesome. Wow, you're really buying all in there. City
I am right
council.
now.
That's awesome. That's good for
Yeah.
you. And as far as the whole consult, I understand as I left my day job 15 years ago. I was in healthcare marketing and I work for
Okay.
myself doing, I do laughter yoga, which is therapeutic laughter and marketing communications. And let me tell you, my point is it's, when you're on your own, it's challenging at times, right?
Yeah, yeah. I've been on my own for 7 years, and in the first 5 years, it was pretty good. The way that our government puts out federal grants and all sorts of things has been very challenging with a couple of our administrations. And so it makes it harder for the nonprofits to be able to bring in training. Here's really quickly, um, police departments and the justice system train for liability. And so right now, we're training and doing a lot more CIT sort of stuff, like what you were talking about. And we're doing de-escalation because, well, we're shooting way too many people. We shouldn't be, anyway. Um, but then how do we de-escalate that? Because now we've got all these big, huge, huge lawsuits, right? That has not trickled down to sexual assault and domestic violence. There's been some big ones, but not a lot of them. And so the system will put money to where it's getting sued. So the nonprofits, um, the domestic violence shelters and things like that will write for federal grants to bring Julie or myself in and then put on a free training for law enforcement to get their CEUs. And they're like, well, it's a free training, we might as well just go. And that gets us in front of them. Very rarely is it the police department or the prosecutor's office that's bringing us in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, but unfortunately, it's the Gen X skeptic in me. It's like the lawsuits. What does it boil down to? Money, right? That's what we usually put as our biggest priority.
Yeah.
Julie, as we start to wrap up, anything else that you wanted to raise a point about or to educate about while you have this platform for my listeners to hear? Anything else you wanted to that maybe I didn't ask you?
No, well, I did just want to talk about, I know Justin and I have sort of mentioned casually the neurobiology of trauma, and that you have had individuals on your show who have talked about self-defense and women protecting themselves. And one of the things that I've found throughout all of my cases, and Madison's was included, is actually women who've had a lot of self-defense and really thought that they would defend themselves in those situations aren't any more likely to defend themselves than anyone else because of what happens in your brain, which is your prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? And what your prefrontal cortex does for you is that executive functioning, all of that, if this, then that sort of thinking goes away. So you've always had a plan. If I'm attacked, I will do this. But when that part of your brain isn't working and the more primitive part of your brain takes over, the emergent, kind of part of your brain takes over, you don't do the thing that you've been trained to or expect that you will do. And I only say that because I think sometimes we give women a false sense of security with self-defense. I also think that women forget that 90% of the people who might assault them are someone they know. And it's very hard to use self-defense against that boyfriend, that spouse, that date that you're with. It's harder to use it than you would against the stranger in the bushes. So I want society to understand that, even if we're trained, even if we have a plan, our body's going to take over and decide how we're going to survive that sexual assault. And that may mean not fighting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of guilt with that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I know that was a point in the documentary that you brought up. And, it's interesting because I've only taken through the years ago, I took it was a Kung Fu based self-defense. So it was kind of fun, just to learn the moves. And then I took another one recently that my friend offered. But I would always think to myself, I have no idea how I would respond if it were to happen. Because, like you said, you'd like to think that you would do X, Y, Z, but I'll be honest, I didn't really have faith in myself that if that would happen, because how the heck would I know in a situation like that? How would I know that how I'm going to respond? And, and to your point, it's interesting that, there is a false sense of security about that. And the point of the fact that it is people in most cases that they know. I think that's really important for people to understand, for sure. Yeah. Is there anything that you'd want to share, Julie, about the experience as far as with Madi and this whole case that you took away, whether it's even something rewarding that you felt or anything insightful, something that you took away from the experience?
Oh, well, I think what I took away from the experience is really just the strength of Madison and her mother and that whole family relationship, and how they kept fighting for Madi, and as long as Madi was in the fight. And so many sexual assault victims are disbelieved, even by their own families.
Mm-hmm.
I tried cases with young teenage girls whose family did not support them, who even went out of their way to try to say, well, maybe you shouldn't believe her either, to me. And so having that experience, in fact, I always said when I was doing child sexual abuse, right, the mom is going to believe the perpetrator boyfriend over the child every day of the week. And so to have this happen to her to watch her family immediately surround her with love and support, take her through this journey. Like, I knew from the day that I met Maddie that no matter how this came out for her, that she was going to be fine, right? That she was going to survive this and go on and be a strong and healthy individual. And so for me, that was the best part of this case. Is I don't like to lose at anything, not even Monopoly. And so the fact that we didn't get the outcome we wanted will always be hard for me. But knowing that Maddie and her family have such a strong bond and are going to be fine, that's what I will take with me from this case.
And would you say, just my follow up to that, it's probably even more important that it's really how does she feel about it at the end of the day, because it's, someone else's victory or loss in a courtroom isn't the point if it's about her peace, her healing and moving on.
Oh, absolutely. And that was a huge lesson for me to learn as a prosecutor, because I'm not going to lie, I like sending people to prison. It was a good gig. I liked winning cases. I liked getting convictions. But the young girl that I mentioned in that case, she had been sexually assaulted by another family member, and the family supported that family member and not her. And it was a very difficult trial, and we lost. We got a not guilty. And I was a very bad loser. So I would stay in my office with the door closed for 3 days after not guilty, and I'd be checking the want ads for barista jobs because I was pretty sure I was a terrible lawyer. And no one would talk to me. They knew not to talk to me. And so after this loss on day 2, I get a knock at my door, and I'm like, I'm not seeing people, right? I'm in my 3-day funk. And our receptionist said, no, you want to take this. And I went to the front desk, and there was my teenage victim, with a bouquet of flowers and a card for me that, of course, she had to purchase with her own money because her family wasn't supporting her, and she would have had to get to the courthouse on her own. And she really wanted to thank me. And I still have that card to this day because it says, it didn't matter to me if we won or lost. What mattered was you were the first person that believed me. And so for that young woman, justice looked like belief and support. And I had to learn that as a prosecutor, that conviction is not always what is justice for the victim, right? It's going to look different for them every time.
Wow, that's got to be amazing. A meaningful card. I can only imagine. Yeah, that had to be pretty powerful. Yeah, Hilary, I'm going to let you have the last word. What did you take away from this experience? I know it might be difficult, but obviously these are wonderful people, Justin, Julie, the Smith family. What's the one really insightful thing, or the thing that warms your heart, that you could take away from this whole experience?
I think I took away from it that there is an incredible country full of people out there. And the way Madison and Mandy, wouldn't give up when doors shut in their face is how they found Justin. And then Justin brought in Julie, and they all went on this journey together. And that there's a lot of great people, a lot of help, a lot of support, especially when you hit roadblocks and systemic problems. So that was really inspiring. And then I think the other thing that really, sticks with me to this day is learning about the neurobiology of trauma. And the other part that we haven't talked as much about that is that not just the sort of fight, flight, or freeze, but the fact that your memory remembers things in different ways. And so many times victims get people picking apart their story. Their story isn't consistent enough. It doesn't sound like a very logical A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, because things happen this way, because a victim is remembering things in different ways. And sometimes they're not seeing what you expect them to see. It's a smell. They're looking at something else. It's something they saw on the ceiling looking up. Their memory can be very fragmented and not quite in the right logical order. And so the fact that the kind of training that Julie and Justin do, that hopefully in the future will be in law schools and police academies, will be about not just fight, flight, and fear and fawning, that kind of body response, but also about memory and trauma, and how to do these more informed investigations, like the kind that Julie oversees in Texas, where victims are able to tell their story over time and in less of a confrontational, inquisitorial manner where the memory unfolds slowly and they can get out their memories without immediately having suspicion cast upon them. So, when more victims can get that kind of treatment in the criminal justice system, will make huge advances in terms of, possible justice for victims of sexual assault.
Yeah. And that's a great point. But I think also, I feel like jurors need to learn that, right? I mean, they're the ones deciding. I mean, I think they need to be educated as well, about, so when someone, does poke the hole, it's like, well, that's not how a person remembers. And I think we all need to be educated on that to do better by survivors.
Yeah, I mean, one hope is that, the more people that see this film, they'll see the bias we all carry within us that you mentioned, and that they will look at sexual assault victims differently as well and understand that more, hopefully. And, the film is distributed by Women Make Movies, and you can go to the Women Make Movies website and access the film and have a local screening in your own community, at your college, with your book club, community center, high school, church or synagogue or any other community group. And, we'd love to get more viewers to watch the film, because I think there's just something in this film for everyone to learn and come away with, and learn how we can all support victims of sexual assault, both in our personal lives and in the criminal justice system.
I think that's great. Well, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Hilary, for sharing your time, your expertise, and for everything that you're doing out there.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
thank
much
you.
for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. In the show notes, I am going to put, excuse me, a link to Finding the Right for you, Julie, Justin, your website, and of course, Hilary, how to get the film, and how I think it's a great idea. I mean, here in Scranton, I'd love to see what we can do here. There's so many colleges and universities. Well, thank you again so much. I mean, I do think this is so valuable. I really do hope people will listen and watch the documentary, or at least pick up something from this conversation that will hopefully make them want to listen to a different kind of podcast instead of just true crime, and maybe read something else other than true crime. So
Well,
thank you
so much.
Absolutely. If you would like to be on the podcast, please reach out to me. Or if you have someone in your life who you're like, wow, this woman is doing XYZ, and her story should be shared, again, please reach out. I'm always open to that. If you'd like to sponsor conversations like this, I do offer podcast sponsorships. And of course, patron sponsorships are only $20. Again, reach out to me. It's cheaper than if you have a coffee addiction. I assure you, it's cheaper to support these kinds of conversations. And so thank you again for listening. As I say each week, I appreciate you from the bottom of my heart and the bottom of my wine glass.